Phil bring his research here and actually do some site studies while in Hong Kong. So I would invite anybody to ask questions during the talk, as in other talks. Just feel free to interrupt Phil as he's presenting. Otherwise, you can save your question till the very end. You can also feel free to type questions into the chat function, and we can ask Phil on your behalf. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Phil. We'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. So I'll just start this up. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about my practice and my research and how it's developed over the years. And like Tom was saying, how my visit to Hong Kong was very informative for my practice and all the research which I did there. So this is also the first time I've done a talk like this on Zoom, and I kind of found the idea of giving a talk on Zoom quite interesting, especially related to my research and my practice, because I'm really interested in these sorts of virtual spaces and how they often have physical infrastructure behind them, which is often hidden. And so I'm speaking to you from my home in London now, and you're all presumably at your homes in Hong Kong. And so it feels as if I'm having a conversation with my computer. But I was kind of interested as to what was actually happening within this. So I did a bit of research into Zoom and where they host their data centers to see if I could figure out where this conversation is actually happening. Where's the data being exchanged? And presuming that this call is being hosted near the Kai Tak campus, I did a bit of research, and our conversation could be happening right now in the Welltech Center in Sanpo Kong. And so I found it kind of interesting that we're having this, I'm giving this talk over Zoom when I'm talking about these virtual spaces and actual realities. And so, yeah, I wanted to kind of get a sense of where we actually were when we were having this talk. And Zoom has recently added a new function which allows you to choose the region where your server, which server you're using. And this is apparently because a lot of calls which weren't based in China were being directed through China, and there were worries that some of that data could be being used by the Chinese government. And so now there's an option that Zoom have introduced that allows you to select the region in the world where your server is for your call. And I've always found these moments when something is presented as being virtual or immaterial slips away, and we get to see the physical side beneath these facades. Especially because lots of these technologies present themselves as being completely international and immaterial, even in the language that they use. So language such as the cloud, something which is immaterial, exists in the sky, isn't defined by national boundaries. And one of my favorite examples of these slippages of this idea of immateriality suddenly becoming real is a story of this elderly Georgian lady in Europe who was digging to try and find some copper. She was using a metal detector so that she could recycle the copper. And whilst digging, she cut through an internet cable which connected the internet to the whole of Armenia. And in doing so, cut off the entire internet to Armenia for a week. And when she was interviewed about it afterwards, she said she didn't realize that the internet existed underground. And I quite liked this idea of the internet existing in a physical place, but people not really having a sense of where that is. And then there was also, we heard rumors in the UK during the Hong Kong protests last year that the basement in the University of China in Hong Kong had become a hotspot because that's where the Hong Kong Internet Exchange is located. And so that became kind of a hotspot for a lot of the protests. So I wanted to start talking about some earlier works, which also deal with these slippages between the virtual and the real. And they might give more of a understanding of how I got into the slightly more niche world of electronic waste. And so the first set of works which I wanted to talk about was a project which I started in 2012 called Copyrights. And it's an ongoing project. And it started off by using a program called the Google Cultural Institute, which back in the day was called the Google Art Project. They've since rebranded it a couple of times. And I don't know if most of you have used this program or not, but it uses the same sort of technology as Google Street View and allows you to walk through art galleries and see them as if you were kind of there. And you can walk and see the artworks next to each other. You can see the curation of the exhibition, and then eventually you can zoom in on the artworks and see them. And it obviously has its merits in terms of being able to see the curation of a show within the architecture of the museum, but it's always struck me as being quite an odd thing to do, to have something viewed online still defined by the architecture of the building that it exists in physically. But one of the things which I found most interesting about this program was, as you walked around, you'd occasionally encounter these artworks like the one here, which were blurred out. And I found out that this was because the galleries had loaned these works and didn't have the right to reproduce the images of them. And Google, instead of cropping them out and making that look like a blank wall, instead chose to show that they did exist, but not show the image, and so they blurred them. But these blurred effects then end up looking almost like Gerhard Richter paintings or sort of different artists' work, and so they become these things within their own right. And what interested me about these new works was that they only existed on these online reproductions of the gallery. So they only existed as reproductions. There was no original to them. And so I got quite interested in trying to reverse the process of how you would document an artwork. So instead of photographing an original artwork and then putting it online, I wanted to take this reproduction of something online which doesn't exist in the real world and turn it into this kind of surrogate original. And so I ended up working with some artists in the Dafen oil painting village in Shenzhen. And I chose to work with them because apparently 80% of the world's reproduced oil paintings of masters come through this one region. And I ended up going there at one point and meeting with the artists, but I also thought it was interesting to get them to paint something original as opposed to painting a copy, which is what they make their money doing. And the conversations I had with them, trying to persuade them to paint a very blurry image, were quite difficult. But eventually we got there, and I ended up with a series of paintings which they had painted for me, which were of these blurred out images. So here's a selection of these. I also never looked so hard to try and find out what the original works were which had been blurred. For me, it was more interesting that they existed as this new entity rather than as being a blurred Picasso or a blurred work by somebody else. So I never really looked that hard into them, and I wanted my paintings to exist very much on their own. I didn't want them to be defined by what they once were. This is a series of them there from an exhibition. Also, as Google update the software for the Google Institute, they regularly change the blur filters. So I'm playing a cat and mouse game with them where I have to then refind these paintings and then send them off to get them painted again so that they remain relevant. So this work, I kind of wanted to present this work first because I think it shows I'm interested in how technology can change the way we look at artwork. And it's also especially very interesting now with a lot of museums not being able to open physically, and a lot of museums are adopting this sort of technology. But then my work developed from this, and I think I almost flipped my way of thinking from how technology changes the way we look at artworks to how artworks change the way we can look at ideas around technology. And so one of the first works which I did around this was this series of photographs. And these are of computer processors which had been broken up. They were electronic waste which I salvaged, and these are photographs taken using a scanning electron microscope. And at UCL, where I was studying, there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration between different departments. And I was very lucky to be able to work with the Earth Sciences department, who had all of this equipment. And so we took these series of photographs. And because they were very interested in geology, between us, we kind of drew these connections between these photographs of computer processors looking like geological sites, often viewed from sort of satellites. There was often also organic matter, which was accidentally included in some of the images. And at this level of zoom, the sense of scale becomes very warped. And I liked that interplay of the macro and the micro, not knowing the scale of anything really in these images. So through these works, I was also getting interested in the idea of infrastructure as another form of this sort of materiality within the digital world. And once you start looking at the infrastructure of certain sort of digital networks, it can become really fascinating. And I did some research into the internet and how the internet is connected through cables around the world, and was looking at submarine internet cables which connect different countries and different continents. And so this is a map here of all the key submarine internet cables around the world. And you can see how certain areas are connected much more: Europe and North America, China, East Asia, but then other continents such as Africa and South America have limited connectivity. And through my research, I looked at how these cables had been laid, and a lot of them followed the same routes as the old telegraph cables, which were laid in the early 1900s. This is a map of the submarine telegraph cables from the 1900s, and it follows, with the exception of East Asia, follows a very similar route in terms of connecting North America, Europe, and then Africa and Latin America not being as well connected. And then I looked even further back, and this is colonial trade routes from the 1500s, which also follows similar sorts of patterns. And so a lot of this internet infrastructure can be seen to still be following the same sorts of colonial routes that we were using in the 1500s. And looking at this idea of infrastructure, I was then looking at things to do with mining and electronic waste. What happens before a product? Where does the material come from? Where does it get made? And then what happens after we use a product, when we dispose of it? Where does it go? And I came across I got interested in electronic waste and where it moves around the world, and comparing this map to the previous maps of internet connectivity, it's almost the complete inverse. Nothing connects the United States and Europe. A lot more stuff goes to Southeast Asia and to Africa. And so I started trying to track down these dumps. Where does our electronic waste go? And I used Google Earth to try and find some of these places. But even if you use Google Earth to try and find them, then the image quality of a lot of these places is incredibly poor. And comparing this to the image I showed earlier of the data center in Hong Kong, there's almost a level of invisibility to these places. And I'm sure there are many technical reasons as to why the image quality is poorer, but they were very hard to access. And I became interested in this idea that they were invisible sites, places that we don't know anything about. And so in 2017, before I came to Hong Kong, I started collaborating with an NGO in America called the Basel Action Network. And the Basel Action Network tried to uphold the Basel Agreement, which is an international treaty about how electronic waste can't be shipped to developing countries. And they do so through different methods, often involving activism and trying to find people who are breaking these rules. And one of the projects which I became quite involved with them was a project where we were putting tracking devices on old computer monitors. And so we'd cut open the back of the computer monitor, and this is one of the tracking devices here. We would place this inside the monitor and then screw it all back up. And then we'd take these to what were labeled as responsible recyclers in America and in the UK. And these recyclers, part of their promise is that the waste won't leave that country, it will be recycled within that country. Any environmental damage is contained within that country, and it's not sold off to developing countries or to any other country, because that goes against the Basel Agreement. And so we would hand over these computer monitors to these recyclers, and then we would wait. And using these tracking devices, we were able to track where this waste went around the world. And what we found was that a lot of it went to West Africa, and a lot of it was going to Southeast Asia, and in particular Hong Kong. Whereas before a lot of the waste had been going to China, China had recently changed their importation rules on waste. And so now a lot of the waste which was traveling through Hong Kong to get to China was now bottlenecking and staying within Hong Kong. And I was lucky enough in that same year to then go to HKBU, where I then continued working with the Basel Action Network, who had come over from America. And we used this time to track down these devices. Using a device, we could track out our tracking devices to within 1 meter. And so we were able to drive around and find where these computer monitors had ended up. And most of them ended up in the new territories, in these large compounds where it's impossible to just walk in. These dumps are illegal, and they're working with the exporters in America and Europe. And so I was working with not just the Basel Action Network, but also HKO1, who are a Hong Kong online news agency. And so working with them, we were able to gain access to these dumps by pretending to want to purchase large quantities of monitors or hard drives. And we had some of the staff and the journalists from HKO1 posing as our translators. And through doing this, we were able to get lots of information and lots of footage, especially of shipping containers, of crates, any identifiable information which suggested where this waste was coming from originally. And then HKO1 actually made a short video about this investigation, which we took part in. So I'll show that now. The quality of the video might lag quite a bit, but hopefully it explains the situation.
為咗促進回收業發展，政府以超值價租出環保園土地，條件係租戶只可以處理本地廢料。但係我哋同國際環保組織 BAN 調查發現，環保園租戶益達將美國電子廢料運嚟香港，環保園可能已經淪為處理外國廢料嘅工場。繼前年揭發大量美國電子廢料湧港，我哋同 BAN 再次合作，調查電子廢料流入香港嘅情況。
Hey, do you guys recycle like computers? Yes, we do. Okay. I have a monitor and a printer.
上年7月 ，BAN 將一部裝有追蹤器嘅打印機交到跨國回收商益達喺美國嘅回收點。
All right, thank you.
2個月之後，我哋追蹤到部打印機去到元朗一個回收場。記者扮成買家，入過回收場2次，見到大量電子廢料，包括屬於有毒廢料嘅 LCD 顯示屏，仲有電腦同埋打印機，部分標明係嚟自美國。拆解廢料嘅工人全部都着住香港益達嘅青綠色制服，負責人承認工人都係益達嘅員工，又話廢料拆解之後係會送去環保園嘅益達廠房處理。
You know ETAP?益達啊嘛，喺環保園啊嘛。Do you know Benny? Benny Young? Benny Young, yeah. Benny 就個環保園基本都冇拆，佢主要係碎啲我哋嗰啲拆出嚟嗰啲板咧，去嗰邊就碎晒佢咯。
呢個回收場嘅營運商係中華環保。中華環保過去4年同益達共用辦公室，而董事呂建偉係益達嘅前員工，而家就係益達董事政協吳義容嘅生意拍檔。環保園規定只可以處理本地廢料，如果回收場負責人嘅講法屬實，美國廢料送到回收場拆解之後就可以洗底，變成本地廢料，名正言順送入環保園。我哋去到益達嘅辦公室查詢，一個男職員接收信件。當我哋拍攝嘅時候，佢突然衝出門口，推撞記者，唔好搶手機，又搶咗我哋嘅手機，直至到我哋要求報警先至歸還。
你咩媒體嚟㗎？
我哋後嚟去到環保園採訪，亦都俾保安同埋益達職員阻止，甚至拒絕俾我哋離開。我哋以信件、電郵同埋傳真嘅方式向益達查詢，冇收到回覆。
我哋冇 LCD mon 㗎。
你哋冇 LCD， 但我哋影到有啲 LCD mon 擺咗喺裏面喎。
冇 LCD mon 㗎，我冇 LCD mon。
但係嗰啲電腦主機，我哋見到就係美國嚟嘅，其實係咪美國入口嘅貨嚟㗎？
有本地有多數得本。
都係有啲美國嘅，除咗本地之外。
我要睇睇先知。
咁佢就話佢哋係益達嘅員工，其實佢哋係益達定係中華環保嘅員工嚟㗎？
學校嘅標有啲制服定係啊，以前喺大陸過嚟㗎嘛。
咁但係我哋見到成個場嘅員工都係着住益達嘅制服喎。
唔會啊，冇可能啊。
冇可能，
我而家傾緊聲，我唔得閒同你傾啊。
環保署話，從未批准益達處理進口廢料，已經去信要求交代廢料嘅來源。如果證實違反租約，必定嚴肅處理。
So whilst we were conducting this investigation as well, I was also taking lots of photographs myself. And once we located a lot of these compounds, I was using a drone in order to take photographs from above. These are some of the photographs just of these dumps. And I guess with my work as well, there's a very sort of grey area between what I consider to be artwork, what I consider to be activism. A lot of the images which I take, the videos which I make, I will openly allow other organisations to use. And so I just kind of class it all as being work. Certain things will be kind of slightly more artworky, but generally the whole thing, everything kind of works together. So these were just some kind of documentation photographs of these compounds. And then I was taking drone photos of these areas as well. And in the region which they were in the New Territories, there was this amazing contrast between the very lush vegetation and then these metal barriers, which then were containing all of this electronic waste, which wasn't being sent anywhere anymore. It was just collecting and collecting. And so there was this great way of framing this in the drone footage. And also this idea of photographing something from above became quite important in my work. Kind of going back to this idea of Google Earth and how these places aren't well documented, it almost felt as if I was able to then document them from this viewpoint. And I'm just going to show a short video which I also made, which uses some of this footage. Which again might be a little bit skippy, but we'll see. There was something about the motion of using the drone, which I found really interesting as well, that the way it pans very gradually, very smoothly, but then also rotates the image. You end up with a video which looks very much like a user interacting with a map on Google Earth. And there's an interesting play there between using a technology to see something and then the technology being the subject of the video. So these videos, let me go back to the presentation. These videos, as well as other videos which I'd taken of these different sites, then became part of the exhibition which I ended up having at HKBU. And there were lots of different elements. Basically, each video showed a different step of the journey of this electronic waste through Hong Kong. So shipping containers, and then the dumps that they ended up in. But then there were also slightly more abstract elements which were included too, such as the burning of joss paper in the form of electronics in order to send them over to the afterlife. And these are the sort of elements which were then included. And I'd been to, when I was in Hong Kong, I went to Shenzhen quite a few times, as I'd always really been interested in Shanghai culture, and the idea of copied electronics, especially when this culture copies and then kind of improves and changes things. It's always been something which has fascinated me, and so I spent quite a lot of time in the Shenzhen electronic markets. And so whilst I was there, I bought as many obviously Shanghai copycat mobile devices that I could, the sorts of devices which have similar names to brands, but they've changed a few letters. And it's these sorts of phones which actually and end up using a lot of the electronic waste, which makes its way to China, because it's a lot cheaper and can be recycled very easily. But they in themselves are only designed for a very short lifespan, and so actually end up contributing to the problem. So I showed a lot of these videos on these mobile devices, and then also framed the work in a cabinet similar to the sorts which are used in these electronic markets. And whilst I was in the dumps as well, another thing which I was doing was collecting hard drives and USB sticks, or anything which could contain data. I ended up with a few Betamax tapes as well. And I ended up going through all of these hard drives and USB sticks and getting as many images that I could from them, and created an archive of images which I'd found in these dumps, predominantly photographs, but also stock images used for websites. There was one USB stick which only contained passports. There was a huge array of different information which I found, but it's felt like an interesting way of looking at the problem of electronic waste. Instead of focusing on the waste itself, it was reflecting back on the final consumer, the person who had disposed of that device or had given it to a recycling company. And so I ended up building this large archive of all of these different images. And these are a few examples of the different things which were found on them. I ended up having to censor some of the things out. So the passports, for example, I couldn't use, but a lot of the other images I ended up putting together into distinct archives. Each archive is a documentation of a specific dump. And I like to think of these images which I found on them, which are often photographs, as being photographs of the dump. And quite a lot of the images were also corrupted as well, which I found quite interesting going through them, because there's something about the corruption which almost tells the story of the journey that that image has been on, the damage which has been done to the file. And then each individual archive then got made into videos, which were very fast slideshows showing the images in each archive, almost so fast that you can't particularly linger on any image for very long. As I like to think of the archives as something which should be viewed all together, and it's all of the photos together which give an idea of where that waste has come from. So I'll show a short bit from one of those videos now. So there was, yeah, everything from lots of stock imagery, personal holiday photos. And these images are selected from the archive randomly. So at the same time as getting the images off of these USB sticks, I was also documenting the USB sticks themselves, because a lot of those which I had found were also very damaged or told a story somehow of the journey which they had been on in order to end up in a completely different location. And so these images, the photographs of the USB sticks contrasted to the images which were found upon them, became quite an interesting way of telling the story of how this device had found its way to Hong Kong. And these images were taken using a photographic scanner, so they were very high definition and were printed to a very large scale. And the idea was to try and almost present them as evidence in some way. Having worked with the Basel Action Network, I was interested in this idea of how they were collecting evidence when they were going to these different sites. We were looking for data to do with shipping containers and things, and so I wanted to also create this idea within the archive which I was generating. So my interest in these dumps, then I ended up trying to locate more of them outside of Hong Kong after my residency in Hong Kong had finished. And when I was looking online for different places where electronic waste got sent to, one of the main places which kept on coming up was this place called Agbogbloshie in Ghana. And these are several headlines about it from different news agencies, and a lot of them would call it the world's largest e-waste dump, or describe it as being a hellscape or a toxic e-waste land. And so I became fascinated in this place because of its media portrayal, and so I ended up visiting Agbogbloshie in order to see what it was like. But one of the main things which hit me first of all was that it was a lot smaller than I had expected. It was probably about the size of 2 football pitches. And even though the conditions were fairly bad, it was very much a functioning electronic waste recycling facility where waste would arrive, be broken down, metal would be sorted into categories and then eventually recycled and sold to scrap metal dealers. But the strangest part of my trip there was noticing just how many film crews were there. Every time I was at the dump, there were at least 2 or 3 other film crews going around filming different things which were happening there. And I realized that a secondary economy had popped up in the dump where people who were normally working in the dump were now showing around photographers, and they were able to make a lot more money doing so. And because they were making much more money doing so, they were keen to show the photographers what it is they wanted to see. And so often they would show them the more sensationalized elements of the dump, as opposed to showing them the reality of what was happening there. And so this explains why a lot of the photographs of this dump ended up being very similar. So these are photographs by other artists who had been to the dump. This is work by an artist called Kevin McElveny, who took a series of photographs there. This is another photograph of his. But then this is the work of an artist called Pieter Hugo, who also went to the dump to take photographs. And then the band Placebo made a music video in the dump as well. And the aesthetics of the music video are also very similar to a lot of the other photographic accounts of the dump. So even in this case, completely mimicking the Kevin McElveny photograph. And then these stills are from a film called Welcome to Sodom. So these four accounts are probably the four major photographic representations of this dump. And in the film Welcome to Sodom, a lot of this stuff is staged. It's things which people would never do. They'd never set fire to tires. They'd never do any of this burning at night. It was a lot of the stuff which they did was staged in order to make the place look more sensational. So even though I think, and then what had happened with a lot of these images is the Ghanaian government had got a lot of heat from this situation in Agbogbloshie, because these images had circulated a lot online, and they ended up bulldozing a lot of the area and destroying a lot of people who work in the area or nearby, destroying their homes. So even though a lot of the photographers who had gone there and taken these photographs had done so meaning well, the end outcome had actually caused a lot more problems. So even though I went to Agbogbloshie first of all to document the area, I became much more interested in how other people had done so and what these images meant about the area and why people were documenting it in such a way, and also this new image economy which had cropped up in the area, which involved the workers showing the photographers around. So I wanted to try and subvert this system which was existing there, which was showing a false reality and leading to more problems for the locals. And so I ended up doing a lot of projects where I worked with the workers in the dump. One of the first projects that we did was we made a video, which was a 360-degree video, which is available online, which shows the entire process of electronic waste arriving at the dump, being broken down, and split into its component parts and eventually sold. And so because we wanted to show the reality of what was happening, we decided that the 360-degree format was an interesting way to do so, because it allows the viewer to move the camera around, move their phone around as they're watching the video, so that they can see different elements that's going on. There's no prescribed narrative per se, which the initial filmmaker can really put within the film, and each person who watches it can move their phone around and get a different experience from the video. It also, we wanted to put the viewer quite literally in the center of the action. So as you move your phone around you, you become the cameraman. You are in some way kind of present there. But also you're looking at your mobile phone, and your mobile phone is one of the key things which ends up in these locations, as it has such a short life due to planned obsolescence. And most mobile phones only last a couple of years. So I'll show a short snippet from that film just to give you an idea. So this is, the piece is called 5.553.103-0.22640870.net. And that number is the GPS coordinates for the dump. And it felt kind of interesting to title the work after the GPS coordinates. Again, kind of going back to this viewing from above satellite imagery. That's not working. Hang on. This is obviously the laptop version of the video, and so I can move around now using my mouse. But I will also send the link into the chat so that people can view it on their phones, which is how the work is meant to be viewed. The viewer has complete agency to look around and view whichever aspects they want, therefore kind of getting a fuller picture of what's happening at the dump. I myself also appear quite a lot in the video, as I didn't want to exclude myself as being the filmmaker who was there, because I think it's quite important to include my presence. This is something which a lot of the photographers and filmmakers in Agbogbloshie had erased, was the presence of other filmmakers. They'd often get out of each other's way whilst they were taking photographs of the area, and so what they were showing wasn't a true representation of what was going on. The video was made quite a while ago, and so the technology for this 360-degree shooting has improved drastically. So it's something which I'd quite like to go back and remake with better quality video. So another project which I ended up working on with the workers from the dump was a series of photographic workshops. And these we've been doing for a couple of years now. And it's a collaboration between me and a former worker from the dump called Al-Hassan Abdullah. And ultimately we wanted to subvert this image economy which had appeared in the dump by training the workers to, and also providing them with the equipment so that they could document the dump themselves, as they often weren't paid for a lot of the photographs which they featured in. And a lot of the photographers who were going there would earn up to £100, £200 per photograph that they were selling. And in the cases of some of the artists who were selling their photographs, like thousands of pounds per photograph. And so we wanted to give the workers the opportunity to represent the dump and to show it in a more realistic way, one which wasn't just focusing on the over sensationalized images of the fires, and actually showing that it is a functioning recycling facility. And I just want to read something which Al-Hassan, my collaborator on this project, said about how the dump is represented. So he says, There was news that described Agbogbloshie as the biggest electronic waste dump in the world, and then another said it was the most polluted place in the world. These are all false, I know, but it attracted attention, and students and other people wanted to know, especially environment advocates. They wanted to see what is there, and then it became like a tourist site. They come almost every day, and I must say at a point, I was almost fully employed showing people around Agbogbloshie. But what I noticed was when they came, they are shocked. They don't see what they expect. And so as much as possible, they are asking you to send them to some places where they can see at least something that they expected. For example, there was a film crew that came to Agbogbloshie, and they contacted me that they wanted to know and to film was what time do the ships with container loads of electronics arrive at Agbogbloshie. They wanted to film them arriving. I told them ships don't come to Agbogbloshie, it's not close to the sea. There is no harbour here. And they said, no, this is where they bring our waste from Europe. And I said, that's just a weird story you've heard. That is not the fact. The fact is that we import electronics, send them to the market stalls, and then people buy them into their homes, use them for some time, then they break down, then they sell them as scrap to scrap dealers who bring it to Agbogbloshie and then start the recycling process. When they arrive, they already have questions they are coming to answer. They have things they want to see, and most of the time their time is very short. So they tell you, I want to see where they are burning the electronics, and I want to see somebody dismantling computers, you know, so you can take them to where they can see those, and that's it. I want to emphasize that the issue of Agbogbloshie has many dimensions. The economic dimension is also very critical, and that is what many foreigners never see. So when you come to Agbogbloshie and you are an environmental advocate and you want to see more of the electronic burning, then people will ask you to give them money and they will show you. You give them money and they will take you to that place and you won't see the other side. Then when you come and you are the other way around, then you give them money and they show you what you want to see. And with time, all of these two groups have become friends to Agbogbloshie because they bring in money, and that is what the people are there for. People are working day and night for money. So when someone brings in money, they do what they want. Some of the burnings you see in the videos are staged because people come at that time and there are no cables to burn. But what they want is to film cable burning. So you bring some together, put some plastic together, and you burn it for them to film. If I know you want to see where they are burning the electronics, that is what you want to see. And if you want to pay me to send you there, I'll send you there. I don't know why you want to see it, and I don't even explain the other side to you. I just want to show you what you want to see. And that's true, that's what happens. That's why a lot of that side alone is shown. I have shown some people to film around, and I witnessed them film both sides. They film the very small part where burning is taking place, the only one location where burning takes place, and then they also film the whole market of metals. They film all of that, but at the end of the day, you watch their videos and you don't see that part with the metals. They only showed the electronics because they came here with that as a purpose. Some of the issues of photographers pouring into Agbogbloshie every day to take our photos and videos, and then they go and tell these stories, has been very controversial topic in Agbogbloshie. I say controversial as many people are now waking up to the fact that people use their photos to sell stories, and the stories that they tell about them most of the time are not the whole truth. It's either partly true, partly false, or sometimes wholly false. And so people are not happy, and they feel that sometimes, but for the money they get from the photographers, they still let them take photos. The money that comes from photographers enhances the whole economy of Agbogbloshie by giving them a few dollars, and so they are happy to allow them to take photos. But one of the things we came up with was that we should be able to train photographers in Agbogbloshie to take our own photos and tell the right stories. That's if there is a need for photos at all to be taken. And I must add that we are not saying that people shouldn't take our photos, but we prefer the right stories to be projected. And so working with Al Hassan, we put on a series of photographic workshops, and through funding from UCL, my university, we were able to provide them with lots of high quality camera equipment. And this is one of the contradictions of the dump as well, is that people are surrounded by electronic equipment, but none of it works. And then you have people coming into the dump with very expensive camera rigs documenting this area, but telling stories which are often exaggerated or false, and there's nothing that the workers can do about it. And so we wanted to equip them with the skills and the photographic equipment so that they could tell some of these stories. And so the workshops for Al Hassan and I exist on two levels. Firstly, there's the photographs, which I can show you some. This is some of the photography workshops. First of all, there's the photographs which the workers end up taking, which are completely their own photographs, and they can do whatever they want with them. We help them enter their photographs into prizes, try and sell them if they want to. We kind of help give them different opportunities which they can take. But secondly, for Al Hassan and I, there's also the discussions which we have with the workers, where we sit down and we talk about the issues of representation. So these are some of the photographs taken by the workers. These are all taken by Awal, who gave me permission to use these photographs. So this shows the scales in the dump which they use to weigh the scrap metal. This is some of the markets where some of the electronics which can be repaired ends up getting sold. And this is some of the new equipment which never gets documented in a lot of these articles. And then also the people who are there taking photographs, which also never get photographed themselves. And this is the story of Agbogbloshie, which is never told, is that it's become this almost visitor attraction of people going around taking photographs. So we're hoping that these workshops can continue. At the moment, obviously, nothing is happening. But we've had 2 or 3 of these workshops now. I've been involved in one of them, and we're hoping that these can continue and become something which just operates by themselves. We're hoping that some of the people who are working within them can start leading them, and that they'll have the equipment there. And we're hoping that some of the photographs which come out of them as well can also help tell a more complete story of the issues of Agbogbloshie. So yeah, that's kind of a series of work which I've been doing based around Agbogbloshie. So a lot of the work which I have been doing in Ghana and Hong Kong, as you can see, is kind of quite collaborative. I work quite a lot with different NGOs or with the workers in the dump, and often it involves traveling to specific locations. And so obviously doing any of that now is basically impossible. And so the work which I've been doing more at the moment, well, I've been doing a lot of writing, and given a couple of similar talks to this, where I go back through, look at old projects and end up writing about them. Or I don't really keep a sketchbook, but I do keep a lot of notes about projects and different things which I want to do. And so I've been going back through and reading through those, and the time between making those notes and then the present time has given me some time to kind of look back on them and view them in different ways. And so I've started quite a few new projects just because I've been going back through old work and reassessing it. And one of the things which I have been working on at the moment is playing with a project which was done by an artist called Michael Asha in the 1980s. It's a form of mail art which was quite popular in the Fluxus movement during the 70s and 80s. And Michael Asha was based in West Germany, where a lot of trucks would drive to East Germany in order to dump toxic waste. and in order to get the news of that across the Berlin Wall was quite difficult. And so a project which he devised was to take photographs of these trucks before they entered East Germany and turn them into postcards, because postcards could quite easily pass across the Berlin Wall because they're viewed as being quite innocent objects. And he'd put all the details of these trucks and the companies on these postcards and post them over so that the information could get across the wall. And so I've been working on a similar sort of project myself, using the information which myself and the Basel Action Network have collected from Hong Kong and also from Egbert Bloshi, and created my own series of postcards, which I intend to send to the recyclers whose waste has ended up in these areas. So these are still very much work in progress. Anyway, that's what I'm up to at the moment, but now might be a good time to open things up to some questions.
Thank you very much, Phil. Fascinating research. Many different areas that you're touching on. Shall we ask anybody from the audience? If you have a question, please ask. Again, if you prefer not to speak, feel free to type a question into the chat function and I can ask the question on your behalf. Phil, before we have any questions, with these postcards, what is your intention for physically posting them?
Yeah, so I want them to physically be posted from the areas, so from the dump sites or the areas around them. I quite like the idea that they're retracing the steps that the waste took in order to end up at that location. And it's almost mimicking something which a lot of Southeast Asian countries are doing now, where if they get a shipping container full of electronic waste, they just return to sender. Yeah. And Malaysia has been doing it quite a lot to the UK recently, where they just send shipping containers straight back. And so I guess it's almost symbolic of that in some regard.
And can you get addresses from some of the waste itself, or send it back to it like random addresses in a particular location?
Yeah, I've done similar things like that before. Yeah, I mean, for a project which I'm working on at the moment, it's this is just something which I can do at home. But yeah, I'd like to do something along those sorts of lines.
Good. Again, while we're waiting for questions, I guess something occurs to me, and I think we maybe discussed this while you were here also. It's that baked-in contradiction of dealing with electronic waste, but the medium for dealing with it is something that will be a future electronic waste, like the drone, the computer, the Zoom, everything we're using. How do you kind of contend with those contradictions, or do you contend with those contradictions?
I mean, there is an element of that within the work, but then I tried in my work not to make physical objects. I prefer to make videos or something which exists online. So then it can be shown on any television. It can be shown on different devices. Those devices are always going to exist. And so, yeah, I try not to make physical stuff as much as possible. And so, yeah, the work can just be emailed to a gallery. Yeah, so, but also in the case of the work which I showed at HKBU, which used the Shanzai phones, I guess there's a balancing act of making a gesture, and then also kind of not using something which is wasteful. yeah, which is it's a fine line to tread.
I guess it's a difficult. It depends. I think how you put it in terms of whether your work is artwork, activism, investigative journalism, and you just decided that you don't need to define that. It is just the work. I was kind of wondering, as an artist, did it take you a long time to come to that conclusion? Did you wrestle with whether, as an artist, you should be making something like the paintings from China, for example? We could say, oh, artwork.
Very much so, yeah. And I always thought that I wasn't making that much, because I was taking a lot of photographs and then they were being used for lots of different reasons, but I was never exhibiting them as photographs. But there was still work that was happening and they were still doing something. They were just doing it in a different way. And it took me a while to realize that they're still fulfilling the role of an artwork. They're just doing it in a different way, and they're being used by different people, and it's reaching a broader audience in some ways. And so, yeah, it did take me a while to realize that those sorts of things were equally valid as artworks or as just work. Yeah.
It makes perfect sense, and I totally agree. But I know as a maker, as an artist, it's one thing to just say yes, it's all the same, but it's another to actually come to terms with that. I think Michael Asher is a really good example of an artist who, put up all of the partitions in a museum over the period of time it's up, and that's an installation. It's a really great artist to reference in those terms.
I think for me as well, it also comes down to what I was just saying about not liking to really create physical work. And so if a lot of the work you're making is digital anyway, then I've always found it makes more sense to then just share that so that other people can use it, because there is no unique version of that photograph. And I'd rather it was used by different NGOs and different activist charities in order to actually make a difference.
Still waiting for questions, so lucky me, I'll get to ask more. Antonia, do you want me to read it out, or do you want to just ask yourself?
I can read it in the chat.
All right. Hi, I'm Antonia. Thanks for the talk. It's very informative. I want to ask if you think that the copycat electronic devices made in China is actually not bad.
I mean, I think some of them, there's such a broad range with the different Shanghai devices which are made. I think some of them where they are just made purely for fashionable purposes, then yes, it's just that they only last a year, and they tend to be the sorts of devices which aren't recycled anyway, and so yeah, it's just contributing to waste ultimately. But I think a lot of those devices also incorporate different features which aren't on the originals, and they expand and build on them, and I think in some ways they can be quite interesting in terms of they create new things which are original, and I think that element of it can be quite interesting. But I think a lot of this sort of copycat stuff, the quality is so low that ultimately it is just kind of creating waste for a year's time.
I remember the blue flip iPhone was very popular with the students in the exhibition, and I think actually Antonia was there also, very impressed with the blue flip iPhone. So, okay, I guess Phil, is it okay to wrap up with one final question? As you are close to completion on your PhD, and congratulations, best of luck with the final stages. Very diverse works, research approaches that you're kind of showing us, have you got to the point where you can kind of encapsulate that? What is the kind of outcome from this research?
Well, I mean, the PhD in itself focuses much more on agbogbloshi, and is very much just about the idea of representation of agbogbloshi and the difficulties that the site has faced with photographers ultimately kind of projecting what is a global issue onto a very local place and ignoring the local politics which happened there. And so that's caused a lot of problems because those two things don't match up there. And even though agbogbloshi is can be used well by different charities as a way of kind of highlighting the issue of electronic waste, and I think it has made people a lot more aware of issues of recycling, the effect that it's had locally has been quite detrimental. And so the PhD is looking at those issues and the image economy which exists in the area, especially relating to ideas of poverty porn, and the exploitation of the workers and the objectification of the workers. And it's looking at different ways in order to represent these problems which can deal with the ideas of global and local. So yeah, that's kind of the nub of the research.
Seems like a very appropriate and succinct place to wrap up on. We'll give final calls for questions. Okay then, well Phil, thank you so much for joining. It's a very, very interesting research. And thank you everybody for joining.